off. Just in case anyone doesn't know Butser Ancient Farm, it's just up the A3 from Havant, near the village of Chilton. And there are houses there from the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, a Roman villa, and a couple of Saxon houses. And they're all based on real archaeology. There are about 35,000 school children visiting each year. And there's lots of other events and workshops for families and adults, including Beltane, which is the burning of the Wicker Man in May. The Roman villa that you can see on this slide was built in 2003 and based on a villa found at Sparsholt near Winchester. The villa itself took more than a year to build, and the original would have had mosaic floors and painted walls. Next slide. There we go. So the actual mosaic is now at Winchester Museum, and the whole mosaic is 25 square meters. The central section that you can see there is 10 square meters, and we estimate 8,000 to 10,000 tesserae for each square meter. So the central section is between 80 and 100,000 tesserae. The outer border, which is red, uses the red tiles. So about they're larger. So we think about 60,000 of those red tiles for the border. So a total of about 140,000 to 160,000 tiles. Okay, slide. So this is the plan from the excavation. So you can see the mosaic in the central room there. The top right-hand corner, you can see just a section of mosaic, and we will talk a little bit about that. That is the hypercourse room. But the beauty of this mosaic, of course, that it's almost complete. The other rooms had plain floors, except for the corridor. Okay. So when we started thinking about how we were going to make this, we had to find out what we could use. Now, the original mosaic uses local British stone, chalk, terracotta, but it was incredibly expensive for us to try and find quarries or suppliers that could give us what we needed. So we ended up using Italian marble, which comes in sticks and can be cut into 1 centimeter cubes. This is a slightly different size to the original. So we had to make some design changes to make our replica of the original. It's not a copy, it's not precise, but it is a replica. There are 4 colors: white, black, red, and yellow. The way we received them, they were machine cut on 4 sides and hand cut on 2. So we had to sort them when we were making the mosaic with a polished side up, because we wanted the whole mosaic to look the same. If we had had the unpolished side, it would have all looked dull. If we'd had a mixture, it wouldn't have looked good either. So that was a lot more work than we were expecting, having to sort all the tesserae. This lovely relief carving from Ostia chose the Roman technique of using a hammer and hardy. So the guy in the middle has got this hammer with a sort of doubly pointed end, and he is cutting down onto a tile underneath it. So the hardy is sort of like a chisel that's been mounted vertically in a block of wood. You hold that little 1 centimeter cube of tesserae there, and you tap it with the hammer, and you're basically splitting the tile rather than cutting it. Now, it takes a long time, I can promise you, to learn to try and get the shape and the size that you want. We had to cut our little cubes into rectangles, triangles, and keystone shapes. We spent a lot of time learning how to do that, but we could usually use the ones that weren't quite the shape we were hoping for in some other part of the mosaic. We think that the original mosaic, they would have probably cut these on site rather than getting them ready cut. And here's a lovely picture of one of our volunteers working with the hammer and hardy. You can see the hammer there with the pointed end, and the block of wood that we've got the hardy, which is the chisel bit.
It's a little bit like a geologist's hammer, isn't it?
It is, it is, yeah. We actually had to order those from Italy when we got them. The role of volunteers in the project, that was really important. We think about 1,000 volunteer hours to make this. And we were concerned when we recruited the volunteers that they might get bored, but they were extremely committed to the project and worked very hard to get as much done as they could by the end of September. So we worked 3 months, July, August, September. Interestingly, Roman mosaicists were paid by the Roman foot, and their wages were about the third of a wall painter trade. So they're tradespeople. They aren't artists. They're expected to get the job done, get the mosaic laid, and then get out. I'm going to hand you over to Trevor.
Sue and I project managed the project, and we split our responsibilities a little bit. My responsibilities were more to do with the sort of physical installation of the mosaic. The first thing I had to tackle was the making of the mortar, and when we started the project, we were told by Lawrence Payne, who is a well-known mosaicist, that no one had done one of these for 1,600 years in Britain, which I didn't believe, because I know there are actually a lot of mosaics around. But it turns out either they're repairs, sometimes done with modern concretes, or most of the mosaics that we're familiar with, like the Woodchester Great Floor, they're actually glued on, and gluing is much easier to work with, as we found. So what we started with was a very rough floor. The floor in our villa was laid 20 years ago, and it is a lime mortar floor, and lime mortar is what we know that the whole Roman world used lime mortar, which is very effective. It's very like a modern cement for making concrete, but it's a little bit, I suppose you'd say, a little bit weaker in that it's a little bit more crumbly. It can be a little bit like the texture of a hard shortbread. And that created a few kind of literally sleepless nights about how we're going to make this fairly crumbly material hold up to, it could be 1 million footsteps over there every year quite easily. And so I sought advice from lots of people and couldn't find any, including from the people who supplied the lime, because this is not a technique that people use anymore. In fact, the art of lime almost disappeared after the First World War for a number of reasons when we moved to concrete, to modern cement. So what we had was a very, very rough floor. Now, you can see here, this is actually Fishbourne, I think. You can see what's happened here is one newer mosaic has been laid over an existing mosaic. So the way mosaics are laid varies quite a lot. There is a Rolls-Royce model, which I'll talk about in a moment, but mostly that's honoured in the breech. So what I decided is to lay quite a thick mortar bed that was made of a lime mortar, which is simply burnt chalk, probably manufactured on site in Roman Britain. You just dig up chalk, burn it, and you've got this sort of cement lime material. We sourced it commercially, but in essence, it's the same material. And what you see here is, you can see the bottom third of the frame is the existing floor, which is very rough, over the top of which I laid quite a thick bed of our new mortar to accommodate for the fact that there were lots of variations in the floor underneath, into which we then sank the tesserae. What you can see in that rather roughly drawn orange line is that's the rough bedding layer, in the depth to which we inserted the tesserae into the mortar, which turned out to be quite a challenge. So what we could have done, I suppose, was to borrow Vitruvius's theme, which is to lay a base floor and then put a very thin coat of mortar on top of that. But as I mentioned, our floor was incredibly rough, and I was not convinced that a thin, let's say a 5mm layer of a biscuit-like mortar was going to hold up when it's trodden on over a sort of very, very rough base. And as I mentioned, there is limited conformity to this description of Vitruvius's. It's an excellent model. He really does describe a fantastic model for laying a mosaic floor. But the reality in the classical world is that they're laid in all sorts of things, sometimes over beds of sand, sometimes on broken pots. And Sue saw one in Malta, which had been laid on a thick bed of lime concrete over the top of amphorae, upside down, complete amphorae.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was that the floor had rising damp underneath it. So there's actually a tremendous variety in the way that mosaics are laid, in the way they're laid on floors. And I call this monolithic. Very difficult floor to lay, as it turns out. It is very strong, but is there any evidence for this in the archaeology? It's limited, but I came across this one at the Museum of London. And if I go back for a moment, oh, that doesn't go back. Hopefully that gives you an indication that that has that same quite deep bed of mortar. The tesserae, you can just see a little bit of blue peeking in at the top. That's one of the tesserae. So laid very similar to ours, but that is quite an unusual way of laying mosaics. Much more often, they're fairly close to the Vitruvian method with a light coat of mortar on top. We'll talk about that briefly at the end. Makes laying these mosaics much, much easier. We had to do quite a bit of experimentation, actually, with getting this lime mixture right. It was, first of all, it was drying too quickly, so we couldn't bed our tesserae down. Well, we could bed a few down and then our mortar would dry. Another mix was a little bit too weak, so it was very much like Goldilocks. We were looking for the Goldilocks mortar mix. We think we found it in the end. But what we did find was, because of the depth of this floor, because we were laying this quite deep, probably 30mm bed of concrete over the floor, we actually had to constrain our about 1/8 of a square metre of the bed of mortar that we were going to lay between custom-made formworks. And that created a lot of laying difficulty. If we'd had that Vitruvian method where we just have a really thin layer of mortar on top, we could just lay it freehand. We could place our tesserae straight into a shallow mortar bed, and then later on we could grout it. But because of the depth of this, we actually had to literally hammer our tesserae down to bed them into this very thick mortar. And the combination of the very deep mortar with the fact that we had to hammer them down meant that we were only laying initially about 1/8 of a square metre of mortar at any given time, and it had to have formwork around it. So you can see in that illustration there, those are actually pieces of cut timber that have been cut to the right partial radius of our circle, or diameter of our circle, and then fixed with bricks so the whole thing didn't move. And we had to cut custom formwork for almost every section of this mosaic. So while I felt that I had designed an incredibly strong floor, I'd also designed one that was sort of diabolical to lay.
Right.
Back to Sue.
So I want to talk a little bit about what makes a mosaic Roman. There's lots of modern mosaics around, a couple of examples here. Beautifully perfect, beautiful straight lines, everything even. But to my mind, it doesn't have the soul, it doesn't have the character of the Roman handmade mosaics. As Trevor said, we had a great help from Lawrence Payne, who's a mosaicist who specialises in Roman work. And he told us about 8 rules for making Roman mosaics. They're about the size of the tesserae, the way they're spaced, making a borderline around key images, keystones to make curves with, convergence of lines, making sure you don't end up with channels in backgrounds or brick wall effects, and making sure that your line ends are good. So I'm going to show you some examples of those. This is a wonderful Ganymede and the eagle. Next one. Yeah.
There we go.
From Bigner. And if you look at the white tesserae that follow the shape of the eagle's head, you'll see this is the typical Roman outline technique, which helps to define the pattern. So everywhere you look, you'll find this outline for decorative pieces. So that's a key thing. The next one I wanted to look at is, if you'd like to.
Oh, sorry.
Sometimes things don't quite work out the way that you might hope. So this is from the British Museum. It's the Bank of England mosaic. And this corner shows you what happens when someone didn't quite work the pattern out beforehand. So if you follow from at the top, back.
Last one was good.
Yeah, no, can you go back? Go back, please. So if you follow that white line that is at the top of the curves in the bottom section of the guilloche, so there's two white lines. Now they should continue round into the corner, but if you look at the piece of the mosaic that is into the corner, the white line is on the opposite side. It's on the bottom when it should be at the other side. So this happens. If there's a problem in a mosaic's pattern, it will almost always be in the corner, and that's the place where you should look if you're interested to see where mosaicists have had problems. Okay, here's another corner. This one's from Bigner, and this is another example of the corner going wrong. The colors are correct, but the curves are uneven, and it's like they've got there and they haven't quite known how to get round that corner. But hey, it's a Rome mosaic. No one worries. They just get on with it. Next one. So here's a nice example of a pattern that gets squeezed. So this is from Fishbourne, the Medusa mosaic. The central circle has octagons, 2 on each side. But the nearest one on the right is thinner than all the others. It's been squeezed. It's missing its border. It must have been the last one of the 4 to do, and they suddenly realized they didn't have enough room, so they just squeezed it in some way to make it fit. Okay, next one. So this is again from Bigner, and this is a fantastic example of when you use the really tiny tesserae. So the ones we were using were 1 centimetre cubed. These ones are probably about 1/4 of a centimetre, so 4 to 1 centimetre, and that way you get fantastic detail. And as Trevor said, I was in Malta recently and looking at some Roman mosaics there, and they were made with these tiny tesserae, and the detail on them was fabulous. Okay, so this is where we started. On the left is a picture of the original mosaic. On the right is what we started doing. Now, Lawrence had advised us to start in the middle of the mosaic and work outwards. And we made a hole in the middle for a string line so that we could make sure everything was circular and followed the pattern. We're just learning how to do this with this one. And so the petals aren't even, but we're not looking for perfection. We are looking for that real handmade Roman look. So we weren't too worried that it didn't look exactly like the original.
But that's our excuse.
Yeah. And here's the wave pattern. So as you can see on the left, again, this is what we're trying to achieve. Now, we had been warned that this wave pattern would be difficult, but it helped us develop our techniques to measure what we were laying so we'd get the right number of repeats. Can you see there? There's some masking tape. So just inboard from the circle of the wave, on the red tesserae, there were white pieces of paper with a black mark on them. We put those on first so we knew exactly where to put the center of the wave, and then we could work out from that to make sure that the wave would fit and we would get the right number of repeats around the pattern. Okay. This is the swastika meander, which the swastika has been a symbol for good luck for many cultures. And we use that string line from the center so that we could pull the string out and keep everything radiating out from the center. So we were always looking for the simplest solution for our measurements. So we wanted to make it as authentic as possible. You know, we could have done all sorts of things with protractors and rulers and so on, but we used string and bits of paper with a mark on them, or sticks, and that worked fine. Okay. And this is the guilloche, which is the twisted rope pattern, which you find in many Romano-British mosaics. And it was really important to work out the central point again, and then make sure the corners all work. So what we would do is we would place the white tesserae in the middle of each guilloche first, and then build the pattern around them. So that way we could make sure it was going to work. And that gives you a little diagram of how that works. So putting the white ones in first, and you can work from there. These are the corners, gives you an idea of what we could do. By that stage, we were getting pretty confident that we could work out how to make these things work without having to inscribe the mortar or try some other way of pre-drawing the pattern. So what we actually did was we just made marks on the mortar, worked out how big things had to be, and then pretty much did it by hand. And then this is the finished result. And you can see on the right-hand side is the original with the hole in the bottom where the tree had gone through the mosaic, and ours is on the left.
You get to vote for which one you think is best afterwards. The correct answer wins a unicorn.
Okay.
So what I wanted to talk to you now was, about the experimental significance of this. Given that Butser Ancient Farm is an experimental archaeology site, we did have, I guess you'd say, an eye to experimental outcomes. But to begin with, it was very difficult to understand what those might be. In fact, there were probably more than I'd realised. One of them was simply to concoct a mixture of lime and to lay a large mosaic on a bed of wet mortar. As I said, most mosaics now are made with glues. In fact, I went looking for how to do this, and I came across a mixture from Ravenna, and I thought, well, if anyone knows how to lay or to relay mosaics in the classical style, it's Ravenna. And they do use lime mortar, but they also use 50% acrylic glue. So they weren't much help. We wanted to do this in as authentic a way as we could. As I mentioned, we knew what Roman mortars were made from. What we didn't know was, really, we don't know much about mosaicists, about how they work. We didn't know how these mosaics were actually set out. So how do we make these patterns? We had our original from Winchester, and what we wanted to do was, where there were 12 repeats of our swastika meander in Winchester, we wanted 12 repeats in ours. Where there were 24 of the guilloche around the square border on each side of the square border, we wanted 24 turns of our guilloche. So we were trying to do our best to sort of replicate it without we're not making a direct copy. We have different tesserae, but we want to replicate it as closely as possible, especially in the geometry. But what we found was actually laying it out is quite tricky. We'd done measurements on the original mosaic, but hadn't realised, because we were using different sized tesserae, our geometries and our dimensions were changing ever so slightly. So we had to do our own interpretation. And what that meant was we had to devise ways of setting these mosaics out. Now, the inner 3 designs of this are all circular. Actually, the inner 4 designs on this mosaic are all circular, which meant to divide it up, we ended up having to use pi. There doesn't seem to be any rationale about why they use 16 of one repeat, 12 of another repeat, and 54 of another. So there are, I think, 16 waves. There are 12 swastikas, and there are 56 central tesserae, 56 turns of that circular guilloche. So we couldn't figure out quite why they would do this. There are kind of easier ways to design or to divide up a circle. So we ended up using pi, which is not too terribly hard, with a pocket calculator. However, our assumption was that we wanted to work from the simplest possible methodology. We figured out that classical mosaicists are jobbing people. They're tradespeople in the main. We don't know that for certain, but I think it's a reasonable assumption. They want to get in, lay the mosaic as efficiently and quickly as possible, get paid, and move on to the next job. So this is what we were sort of assuming would happen for the mosaicists, which meant that I don't think they used pi. I know Archimedes had developed a very good approximation in 200 BC, but I very much doubt that they were using trigonometry on a 96-sided regular polygon to work out the way these things are laid. What we also found was that what we realized at the end of this process was not only was it quite tricky to lay out, particularly these circular designs, but also that if you change the dimension of one, so if you decide, I want 14 of my wave repeats, well, that has a knock-on effect to everything that's around it. All of those designs that surround that pattern need to change. And putting 2 extra waves in, because of the different dimensions, doesn't mean you put 2 extra swastikas in and 2 extra turns of the guilloche in. It means you've got to have maybe 1 extra swastika and 6 extra turns of the guilloche. So the relationships between the way these patterns are set out is quite complex. We haven't figured out exactly how this was done, but again, it suggests that, to me, I suspect that it's a fairly easy system, that the mosaicist going in there, perhaps they're working from a pattern book, which is sort of often suggested. But bear in mind, as far as I know, there are no 2 absolutely identical mosaics from Roman Britain. And of course, no 2 rooms are the same size. So again, you can't just say, well, we're going to build pattern A exactly the same every time. It doesn't work that way. But I think there must be a very simple way for a mosaicist to go in, assess a room and go, okay, we're doing 16 of these, 12 of those, 56 of those. Maybe they use sticks, maybe they use body units. So it could be hand spans, it could be arm spans, and all sorts of things like that. We know from examples that they do lay out patterns using compasses on wet mortar, because one of the really useful things about breaking up mosaics, which is, it's a bit sad, but when broken mosaics are found, you can find sort of setting out methodologies underneath the mosaic. So we know they use compasses, and we know they use compasses to sort of scale various designs. But again, I think they were working from a sort of known set of parameters, a known set of distances between each given pattern repeat. Just don't know how to do it. There's a little aside there, there's a mosaic that was examined in the British Museum that had pigments on the mortar bed. So the mosaic was only partial, and I think it was 2 doves, but part of the tesserae had cracked away. On the mortar bed was pigment, but it all turned black. So they did a spectroscopic analysis, and it turns out that each pigment was originally the same color as the tesserae that was going to be laid on top of it. So we know that they did paint by numbers, but that's for the more detailed figurative mosaics that Sue was talking about. It was often called opus vermiculatum, which is worm work, because the little tesserae look a bit like worms. Now, over to you. How might we sort of deduce how these things are working? Well, it would be interesting to go and measure mosaics. So when you next excavate, you might want to measure the dimensions between, say, the centers of swastikas, or the centers, the little white points around which the guilloche turns, which are called the eyes. And next one after that, measure them again. Is there a standardization of dimensions which allows mosaicists to walk into a room and go, yeah, 16 of those, 12 of those, 56 of those, off we go, boys and girls? Is there a correlation of these dimensions from different areas? So we wonder, if we accept that there are schools of mosaicists, like the Central South and the Southeastern School, one of those ideas that's postulated for Romano-British mosaics, that you have kind of different ateliers, I suppose, working in different areas. does each use the same sort of dimensions on the different design elements? And how are these design elements repeated? So I think you could do a lot of field work on this. It wouldn't change the way we understand the Roman world. Empires don't turn on this, but it would give us insights into the sort of working life of ordinary people in the Roman world in general. So briefly now, and I think we're about on time, just wanted to talk about our latest project. So Sue, you might like to talk about the King's College mosaic.
Okay. So as I mentioned, when we looked at the floor plan from the original excavation, the hypercourse room had just a little section of mosaic left in it. So when King's College London and the London School of Mosaics wanted an interesting project, they came to us with the idea of laying or designing and laying a mosaic in that room. Now, obviously, they had learnt from our experience, and their mortar layer was much thinner, which allowed them to work much more quickly. They came up with a design, as you can see, that takes some of the elements from the big mosaic, the guilloche, the swastika corners, and the central roundel. They decided they would make a portrait of Peter Reynolds with a roundhouse. Which seemed incredibly appropriate, of course, as the founder of Butser Ancient Farm.
Yes, we did actually consult with King's College and London Museum, London School of Mosaics, sorry, who are wonderful friends of ours. And based on our experience, A, with the difficulty of laying our floor, but B, with realising that what looks like a fairly crumbly mortar is actually very, very strong, we're able to confidently say, look, just lay it on a thin bed of mortar. Caveat there is, this room originally also had a very rough, very old floor. And over the top of that, I laid a thin bed of about 1 centimetre to 1.5 centimetres thick, just of what you call a skim coat to flatten out the floor. That would have been very difficult to lay with that thin mortar bed over the top of the existing floor, but just by creating this sort of screed layer over the top, giving them flat surface, meant they could use a very thin layer of mortar and get a very good effect. So in effect, this room is very much in the Vitruvian mode of mosaic laying. There's the team. And we've just finished an outside mosaic at Butser. We don't have any evidence from Sparshot, and I'm not aware of too many outside mosaics. I've seen some in sort of colonnade areas outside very large villas, sort of around central courts, but no evidence for Sparshot. But Sparshot Villa was quite a big villa. We've only built a small portion of it. It was actually a courtyard villa. So what we have done is create something that reflects the interior design. So you might recognise that 8-petal design, which is a sort of repetition and enlargement of the central area of the inside mosaic. But it also, I think, gives a sort of greater life to our villa. It enhances the impression of this being quite an impressive building in an impressive estate. This mosaic was basically laid over a bed of sand with a little bit of mortar cut through it, so laid very much as a pavement. So now we have 3 mosaics laid in 3 quite different ways, and each has been very successful. Little thanks to all of the people. South Downs National Park sponsored us, gave us good funds for this. Volunteers and staff at Butser. Lists Archaeology also helped. Bignor Roman Villa, Fishbourne Roman Palace, and Winchester Museum were all really great partners. They gave us lots of advice, let us measure things, and just gave us sort of general cheering on. London, King's College London, London School of Mosaics, as we mentioned, and the Association for Roman Archaeology also gave us a very generous donation. So last thing, I'd just like to thank you all. Thanks, Steve, and thank you all for putting up with us. And thank you very much. I'll hand you back to Steve.
Excellent. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Trevor. This is my second time of seeing this presentation, and I'm surprised each time in terms of just how much it covers. You know, like a bit of art, the dreaded maths, and the experimental side. So thank you very much. There is a hand gesture on Zoom. So what I'd like to do is call upon everyone to raise their hands in appreciation, if that is okay. And I actually, there you go. Look, they're starting to climb up. So thank you. No, Nigel, I meant on the Zoom function itself. There are questions. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Let's lower our hands, please. It's a bit of an experiment for the AGM later. In the chat, Peter Holmes, the mosaic in the cover building at St Albans, as a panel put in the wrong way round.
Oh, lovely. What really amazes me about these so-called mistakes is that if you think about it, these are a embellishment for a very rich person's house. So if they really cared about it being perfect, they would have fixed it. They would have said, dig it up and do it again. But it just doesn't seem to be an issue. It's like, hey, we've got the mosaic. It doesn't matter that it's not perfect. It's a handmade thing. Everybody's happy. The mosaicists go off, start another one. They don't fix it.
It does raise another point, actually, that there's been some debate over the years about whether mosaics are laid off-site and then installed in pieces, or whether they're laid on-site. We've obviously demonstrated that the best way actually to lay a geometric mosaic is to do it on-site, simply because you don't have to sort of lay a piece somewhere, bring it in and put it in, risking the fact that it might be back to front or upside down. But that said, there is also, we can be definite that in some cases, mosaics are laid, when I say off-site, they might be laid on a bench out in the doorway and then are actually inserted later. And particularly the more detailed of the mosaics, so the fine detailed portraits and figurative pieces, a lot of those, we're quite certain, are actually laid, let's say, on a table, laid into a piece of formwork, and then are inserted later into the mosaic floor. So there's a bit of both ways can be sort of done with mosaics.
We might have missed it, but the date of the Sparsholt mosaic?
No, I don't think we did say. Early 4th century, somewhere I think between 300 and 320. And by 350 or thereabouts, the villa had collapsed, apparently from natural causes. So it may have been, what happened, we don't know. But the great thing about it collapsing is that no one came along later. No people came along in the 5th or 6th century and dug holes in the middle and lit fires and things like that. The mosaic, the villa collapsed and was forgotten. And the only thing that happened to it was a tree grew up through that floor. So that's why we had such a well-preserved central mosaic, was the villa was never reused.
Okay, thank you. Peter Holmes again, a question, maybe a silly question. No questions are silly. But on slide 3, so you've got to think back, I think, what were the sack-like objects around the mosaicists' heads?
I'm going back to slide.
We wonder
remember
that
the relief. And
yes, we wonder exactly that question. I've never seen them explained. Maybe it's sort of special mosaicist garb, but they're quite bizarre, but I don't know what they are.
Early form of ear defending?
Could be.
I mean, did your volunteers have ear defenders?
No, they didn't. We had protection for the eyes, but we did at the end of the process, we realized that everyone had the same aches and pains, because if you're right-handed, you kind of have to sit on almost on your knee, on your left knee, and then lay with your right hand. So most of our mosaicists were right-handed, and everyone got the same aches and pains. And I was determined to conduct an experiment to get them to keep laying for many years, take some x-rays, look at the bony changes, and then match that to the osteological record and determine who was a mosaicist in antiquity. And I'm very disappointed to say none of them volunteered.
Oh, there's a paper in that somewhere, Trevor.
Oh yeah.
Joshua Ward Penny. There's an invite here. Would you be interested in being involved in creating, laying another mosaic in future? What we'll do is we'll take that one offline, Joshua. I'll if it's a serious offer, then I'll make sure that we're in contact.
We're nodding.
Mary, greetings from Avalon Archaeology, from an Avalon Archaeology volunteer, and I would look forward to visiting Butser later this year. Excellent. Maria Gardner, at Bigner, the volunteers told us that each mosaic had to have at least one imperfection. Could that explain some of the errors?
It's possible, but then if you look at something like the amazing Boy on the Dolphin mosaic at Fishbourne, talking to Rob there, he's counted so far 27 errors in it. So I don't think that's just a token.
That's fair.
The really interesting thing on the Winchester mosaic, there is a single, what appears to be, it's bright blue, and I think it's blue glass tessera, kind of in the middle of one side of the mosaic, and it's really quite singular. So I do wonder that whether some of these imperfections are deliberate. But there's a first century mosaic at Fishbourne, which I defy you to pick an imperfection in that. It's quite staggeringly good. So I don't know. I like the idea, but yeah, I mean, getting perfection is probably only the work of God. So it's going to have a mistake anyway. But that first century mosaic at Fishbourne, which is really staggeringly good.